Regarding Men, Episode 3, Title IX.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Janice Fiamingo. I'm here with Tom Golden and Paul Elam and our special guest, Chris Pekgoz. And he's going to be talking to us about his Title IX, or his activism around discrimination against men at universities in the United States using Title IX legislation. And I'm going to try to give a very brief overview of Title IX first, and Chris will correct anything that I leave out. Basically, Title IX is a federal statute that prohibits discrimination on the basis of, I guess it says gender, sex, basically. It was first brought in 1972. It largely, I think in the early years, was directed towards women's and men's sports teams. There's a whole subject to be covered there about what it ended up perhaps unintentionally doing to men's sports teams, because I think it caused all sorts of problems. Part of how it was implemented was that universities, any university that received public funding, had to devote the same amount of resources to women's and men's sports teams and give the same number of scholarships and that kind of thing. And so it caused all sorts of problems because it included football programs in this legislation, which meant that all sorts of colleges that had large football teams, which need to require huge numbers of scholarships just to make the football team viable, and there just aren't any women's football teams that are equivalent. So it meant that smaller men's teams, different, wrestling, swimming, all sorts of other men's sports had to be axed in order that an equal number of scholarships be proportioned to whatever sports women were interested in, and it caused all sorts of problems. But then, of course, as we know, in the late 1990s, it started to be used for sexual assault and sexual harassment tribunals. All of that was really ramped up under the Obama administration with their famous now Dear Colleague letter, which went out in 2011. Which basically instructed colleges that if they didn't very stringently prosecute allegations of sexual misconduct, or overwhelmingly against male students, I think 99% of those disciplined under Title IX sexual harassment guidelines are men. And that if they didn't very stringently reinforce their rules, it was a strange kind of logic whereby sexual harassment was now understood to be a discrimination and a gender equality issue. So they, proposed a very low standard of proof. They proposed that they basically threatened universities that if they didn't discipline men, nearly any man accused of anything, they would be at risk of losing their funding. It meant that men were brought into tribunals. They couldn't have counsel. They couldn't, in many cases, even know exactly what the charges against them were, what the evidence was. They weren't allowed to cross-examine their accuser. They were just the definition of kangaroo courts, and there have been a great deal, of course, discussion about these problems. Now, the thing that Title IX has not been used for, to my knowledge, up until now, is to actually challenge the real gender-based discrimination that has been in existence for decades and decades, which is the thousands, who knows how, tens of thousands of special scholarships and programs that encourage female participation at the university, even though I think since 1981 or something like that, women have not been a minority overall at US colleges and universities. And in fact, now women are a clear majority nationwide. In some faculties, women outnumber men, by a horrific, embarrassing number in the faculty of education, for instance, also in medicine, in law, certainly in all humanities programs, in all social sciences programs, in most sciences. I think men dominate in numbers only in computing science and engineering now, maybe a very small number of the STEM disciplines. So the question of why we continue to have all of these special scholarships for women only, many people have raised it, but nobody actually did anything about it, I don't think. I hope I'm not slandering any organization that has tried to do something, but as far as I know, no one has done anything with much success until Professor Mark Perry and you, Chris. So tell us a bit about how you came to decide to take this action and what it's involved and what the response has been.
Sure. I think the first idea, or like the prompt kind of like comes from like Mark Perry, because he did publish an article at the College Fix, I believe. And that was his challenge of a female-only study lounge at Michigan State University, if I'm not mistaken. And I think that was kind of like the first time I got the idea that Title IX can be used to challenge, this female-only spaces or programs, scholarships and things like that. And just being a student at USC, it's really impossible not to notice all these female-only scholarships and things like that. Even in journalism, for example, there are female-only scholarships. And sometimes even when they know that they are not legally permissible, they try to get around it by, using circumspect language. Like they say, for example, we prefer to give the scholarships to people who do research on gender equality. And of course, gender equality here really means, their version of the events. But most of the discrimination is actually very explicit. So they openly say that they are granting the scholarships to women only. For example, USC's Annenberg School of Journalism is something like 70% female, and they still have this female-only scholarships. UVA has like a bunch of like female-only scholarships, even though again women are the majority. At Cornell, women are the majority of students and professors. So, but they still have. I think they either directly fund or advertise 360 female-only scholarships on their website for the female majority. And this is just the beginning, by the way. Cornell has what I would call internal affirmative action and external affirmative action. And when I say internal affirmative action, Cornell's affirmative action policy defines women as a minority, first of all. Again, makes no sense. It doesn't add up. But and then women faculty basically apply to certain jobs, they get preferential treatment, again, based on Cornell's affirmative action policy, even though they're the majority. There's also external affirmative action when basically a female student graduates from Cornell, they receive preferential treatment in terms of job placement. So they have a bunch of organizations that are paid directly by Cornell, I believe, or they're like hosted on Cornell's website. There's obviously some kind of organic connection. And the purpose of these programs is to place women in, like better jobs, basically. That's what I would call external affirmative action. Other than that, we have all these like female-only scholarships, and there are also, there are so many, I don't really know where to begin. They also have affirmative action clubs, so to speak, like women in science, women in medicine, women in law, even in fields where women are the majority, by the way. I think most people don't know that women are the majority of law students and medical students at this point. I think even most people don't know that women are a majority of college students, and that's partially because gender politics receives such a biased coverage in the press that some of the basic facts really still surprise people. Most people do not know that men are a minority, and ever decreasing minority for that matter in colleges. Most people do not know this actually. I talk to people, who are not very interested in politics or like gender politics particularly, and they actually express surprise. They don't know that. Most people don't know that 99% of everyone who is expelled under Title IX theory are men. Most people don't know anything about this Title IX bureaucracy because it was designed to be deliberately very opaque. These bureaucrats purposefully designed the system in order to minimize public accountability so that they can, keep doing whatever they want. And given their ideology, most of these Title IX bureaucrats have graduated from women's studies. So we have that like feedback mechanism, unfortunately, and they just keep perpetuating the same environment. So in a certain sense, they have managed to transform colleges into women's studies programs. Like, so it's not, I mean, we are trying to abolish women's studies, or at least like trying to reform women's studies with this complaints, but really they managed to transform colleges altogether into women's studies departments because they have so much absurd power through Title IX, you know, through the Obama administration's irrational interpretation of Title IX, that they managed to, these Title IX bureaucrats often manage to bully like general counsels, presidents, you know, individuals who would normally never take them seriously into submission as far as their particular gender ideology is involved. So which kind of like brings us to the current picture. Of course, they have like women's studies with nothing equivalent for men. And I just want to emphasize this a little bit because I've heard like some of the feedback that I received. A few people reached out to me, including like a few very influential people who told me that I support this complaint in everything except your desire to prosecute women's studies. And that they said there isn't any real interest in terms of taking like male students who want to take men's studies courses, and I don't think that's true. But first of all, there are people who are very serious about teaching men's studies. You know, I talked to Edward Stephens. They really want to teach this. And second, I think there are actually male students who want to take such courses. So I don't think that's actually true. There's one Facebook group called Gender Studies for Men. They have like more than 5,000 members, and that's actually a significant number because the number of students who take gender studies courses is actually fairly small. Like these women's studies programs, they have fairly small cohorts. Like they exercise a lot of influence over gender politics because that's their only field of specialty, their obsession, obviously. But their numbers are fairly small. So 5,000 like male students or also female students who want to take courses in men's studies or gender studies for men, that's actually a very significant number. You know, we will be able to create like dozens of departments, maybe even more, across the country. So I don't think that's a realistic response. And if you have people who want to teach men's studies, and if you have people who want to take men's studies courses, then the question is there any rational reason for an institution to fund women's studies with nothing equivalent for men? And that very basic test, I think, fails under Title IX. And of course, I know that, you know, institutions under investigation, they're going to say, well, we don't hear from like male students, right. Like we don't receive like reports of discrimination. Unfortunately, these bureaucrats are very dishonest. You know, they have very little accountability. They lie all the time. They sit on these reports. Like they receive a lot of discrimination reports from men, and they just stonewall them. The Office for Civil Rights, under the management of Catherine Lehman, you know, who was a radical feminist type, she received 531 complaints, I believe, from male students who alleged discrimination about sexual harassment issues alone. I don't know the full number of like male students who kind of like contacted Allstar about everything. And Catherine Lehman dismissed all of them except one. So she sided with one male student after she was like grilled by Senator Lehman Alexander, and you know, after that was like more accountability and kind of like people started to catch up with like what was going on. But all the other complaints were categorically dismissed. So that's 530 complaints that were received by the Department of Education during the Obama administration, and they were all dismissed because of Catherine's instructions. I think she personally instructed her attorneys to dismiss them because she loved.
Yeah, you know, some people say the Obama administration weaponized Title IX.
Of course, like, I mean, it's very, very true. And I think most people, like even critics of Title IX, I think don't see the full picture because there are very few people who have done all the research, who have collected all the FOIAs and everything. I think most people don't know that Catherine actually, like even critics of Obama Title IX policy do not know that Catherine dismissed 530 complaints by male students. It's really shocking, and some of those cases are actually really atrocious. There's one guy who was in a wheelchair. I think he was being like sexually like harassed or assaulted by like a female nurse. It's like a really, you know, difficult situation where you have like a disabled man who needs help, and Catherine still dismissed his complaint.
I think it speaks also to the larger picture of what's going on college campuses. 2.5 years ago, we sent Sage Gerard, who was our director of academic activism at AVFM, started a men's group at Kennesaw State University. The feminist scholars there immediately set about a campaign to shut that program down. They painted him and the program actually as an existential threat to all women on campus, spread disinformation about him. When he went to inquire about why this was happening, they notified campus police.
Yeah, they do that, yeah.
And filed a complaint. Of course, the police dismissed it. There was nothing there. Sage Gerard did nothing wrong. He simply wanted a dialogue with people about why this was happening.
Yeah.
But, you know, as you talk about a man in a wheelchair, not even a guy that's disabled, can seek justice on campus, it doesn't surprise me, given what I know is the atmosphere on the modern campus. It is so patently hostile toward men that it's mind-boggling that this could even be happening. But
yes,
it is just the same.
Yeah, and that was the reason, I think, probably why maybe a lot of us thought that it wasn't worth the bother of launching any kind of complaint under Title IX, because it was so obvious that to most of us, or it seemed likely that the complaint would simply be filed in the circular file where it never sees the light of day. And I'm sure that has happened to many of those kinds of complaints. So the question is, I guess, then how is it because the Obama administration is gone and there's a new sense in universities that they no longer have the state mandate to continue their program of feminist discrimination? Do you think, because you and Mark Perry have had some success, some quite striking success already, and we don't know, of course, what the future holds, but do you have a sense that things have changed, or are you doing anything differently?
Oh, okay, that's a lot of questions. So let me try to break down. First of all, yes, I think the administrative philosophy of the Obama administration was, hostile to the very idea that, men can face discrimination. And it's actually interesting that some circumstantial evidence surfaced that SPLC just kind of categorically persuaded the Department of Education and the Department of Justice during the Obama administration to categorically dismiss all complaints filed by men, because men's rights activists were, labeled as hate groups.
Right. And
by extension, any man who files a discrimination complaint becomes a men's rights activist, and then becomes a hate speech kind of agent, and then it's dismissed. Complaint is dismissed just based on that grounds. It's really insane. But unfortunately, SPLC did exercise that power over the Obama administration, and it's kind of like a intentional agreement. So I think there is part of it is, yes, the administrative philosophy has changed, but also there are people, some very dedicated people, who are pushing back, and including lawyers. So there are lawyers who won appellate cases. One lawyer won a case in front of the Second Circuit, another one brought a case before the Sixth Circuit and also won. And I think here in California, there's also one appellate lawyer who keeps winning cases with the Court of Appeals at the state court level. And I believe Alfred Rava, who used to be NCFM's, I think, kind of legal secretary. I don't really know their arrangement, but he also won a case in front of the Californian Supreme Court. So there are actually, there is legal activism, there's legal pushback against what they're doing. And occasionally it's successful because, the formal language of anti-discrimination laws, they are really neutral. So they protect both men and women. Of course, it's purely formal, and it doesn't always translate into reality, as we all know. But a judge, especially when there's spotlight on these people, when there's public accountability, they really have to do what is right. So even if they don't want to do. And of course, occasionally you run into sympathetic people. Not everyone is, is a women's rights, a women's studies zealot. So you occasionally run into people who are sympathetic and who understand that there's genuine suffering, behind these tales of discrimination. So actually, I would say it's a combination of all these factors. And there are people, I think, who specifically endorsed Betsy DeVos because of these reforms. So there are people who disagree with Betsy DeVos on other policy issues, but who specifically endorsed this particular issue. So I think it's like a fairly complicated picture, but I do agree, and especially after the Kavanaugh hearings, we saw that this has also become something of a partisan issue, I think, gender politics.
I was going to ask you, Chris, if you felt like that the presence of Betsy DeVos as a Secretary of Education was having any kind of an impact on your efforts.
I've never talked to Betsy DeVos, so this is another misreporting by the press. They said that like I talked to Betsy DeVos. I've never communicated with like Mrs. DeVos personally. I don't know her that well, so what I do know, kind of like from their own statements, is that they are trying to replace, like the Obama administration's philosophy in terms of gender politics was like women face historical discrimination. So anything that we do, no matter how outrageous, is going to do that historical discrimination. So that was the administrative philosophy of the Obama administration as far as gender politics was concerned. And I think like administrative philosophy usually encompasses more than a single person. So obviously it wasn't just Katherine's personal views. There were like Democratic senators who endorsed her, although I don't think even some of those senators might be shocked at how fanatical she is in reality, because like most people don't know still that she dismissed so many complaints while aggressively prosecuting bad faith complaints filed by female complainants. Including, for example, 2 activists who spammed the Obama administration with thousands of complaints during basically like during their regime, and they filed duplicative complaints. They filed the exact same complaint against thousands of institutions, and Catherine Lehman picked them up and prosecuted them. So, and it's really interesting because the press attacked me because I filed 3 complaints. That's like 3 complaints compared to like thousands of complaints that were duplicative, and every single complaint that we write is actually unique. Like they're all very different from each other, and they all involve original research. And the press still attacked me, and I think also Mark Perry, as like serial filers, because we're filing like multiple complaints.
Because
like,
you're fair to men.
Those feminist activists have filed thousands of duplicative complaints, and in some cases they even got monetary like rewards for some of their complaints, whereas like all of our advocacy, both mine and Mark Perry's, that's pro bono. So the imbalance is really shocking, and I guess that's one reason why a lot of men don't want to engage in men's rights activism, is because of that imbalance. Like you face shaming tactics, you have like very realistic chances of getting fired from your job. You know, it doesn't pay. So when you put all these factors, I think only like a small number of like very, I guess, like persistent people can kind of like carry on with this line of advocacy. So
well, thank you for your persistence.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it.
I'm doing my best.
Can we talk a little bit about your complaint? Because I really want people to learn about what you've done. And
there are multiple complaints.
Beautiful, man.
There are multiple complaints. Thank you. Like the Cornell complaint specifically, and they are collaborative documents. Like I send drafts to people. Sometimes I suggest changes, and sometimes I incorporate those. So I guess I'm not the sole author of the Cornell complaint. There are many others, including a STEM professor from Columbia and several attorneys who looked at the document, made like suggestions and things like that. And right now, I believe we have something like 120 signatures. I've also heard back from maybe like a dozen or so people who said they really want to sign, but they have concerns over retaliation. And we also have a few people who don't want to sign because of antisocial reasons, as you know, Tom and I were discussing earlier, but let's not go into that.
No.
So,
but the list you do have is very prestigious. Many of those people are very well known, and bless their hearts for taking a stand.
There are like think tank presidents. There are several. Let me have a look. I think Claremont Institute, for example, is one such think tank. The names are new to me, so I'm still struggling. I'm really sorry, but there are quite a few, like presidential signatures, so to speak. And there probably will be a few more. There are 3 American Enterprise Institute scholars who signed the complaint. Those are Edward Blum, who is, like challenging Harvard on some like somewhat similar issues. And Mark Perry and Christina Hoff Sommers, those are the signatories. Warren Farrell has signed the document.
Yep.
Jordan Peterson has signed the document. The chair of the sociology department at the University of Miami signed the document.
How about that?
It's interesting to have a sociology chair signing the document. That's kind of like a very rare occurrence.
Yeah. Cool.
So there are people.
That's a great list, man.
There are a lot of like presidents, lawyers, and academics who have signed the document, and that's probably, you know, like somebody has to do the pushing first to create kind of like a impetus, so to speak, and bring this into public consciousness, and then I think some people are more comfortable signing on. But there's definitely, I guess, like a consensus at this point that, you know, something is wrong with college campuses, and I think an increasingly more and more people are kind of waking up to the fact that that problem really begins with women's studies and what they're doing. Because another thing, like some people are concerned that like if we abolish women's studies, that will, you know, end the study of like gender or sex from a scientific perspective or something like that. That's of course really ridiculous. And I think anybody who is familiar with these disciplines, they wouldn't really be saying things like that. But most of the meaningful research that is done about gender or like sex or about those issues are actually coming from different disciplines. So they're usually carried out by legal scholars, or sometimes you also have like sociology departments that produce like meaningful research that is not, you know, like that doesn't have the same tilt. You have obviously biologists do most of the real investigation that actually produces meaningful scientific data. So, I mean, abolishing women's studies is not going to have an impact on, let's say, the scientific inquiry into sex, gender, like biology, biological differences, things like that. So that will still happen, but these overly politicized departments will, of course, take a hit. And they really shouldn't be engaging in this kind of like political advocacy using taxpayer money anyway. So if they can fund themselves, fine, they can try to do that. So, but they shouldn't be using taxpayer money to spread this kind of extreme partisanship on college campuses.
Agreed.
Chris, do you have the Cornell complaint right in front of you? Like for somebody who doesn't know what it involves, could you read the first couple of sentences or the actual statement of the complaint so that
it's a very long document, so I wouldn't know where to begin, but
is there not a very short statement at the very beginning that kind of outlines the, you know, what the target of the complaint is?
Well, what I can say is I don't know how to share my screen, but there are 26. I'm sorry?
We'll put it up on the screen later. You can just
okay, that's fine. So there are 26 programs. So I'm looking at the addendum, which is like the final page where I list all these discriminator programs. There are at least 26. I mean more than 26, but because some of them actually branch into, you know, sub-departments and things like that, programs. And many of these receive, of course, large amounts of funding from Cornell. And just to remind again, women are the majority of students and professors at Cornell, and they still receive all these extra benefits. And, you know, people are saying, like, of course, like men's rights activists are attacking women's scholarships, blah, blah, like all the typical, like, hyperbolical discourse. But really, once injunctive relief is granted, the female majority will be able to compete with the male minority on equal footing. So we are not actually asking for affirmative action for men. We are just asking for equal treatment under the law. So
yeah, maybe, you know, I'd just like to say, Chris, that I really enjoyed reading this document. I mean, I think it's 28 pages, but I really enjoyed it. And it starts off by basically saying, you know, men have problems too. You know, and it talks about the biggie data, and it talks about the problems that men face, the discrimination and difficulties men face. And then it goes on and lays things out in a really cogent manner that is well worth reading, folks. You know, hopefully we'll have a link to the document. Chris, can we do that?
Yes.
And Chris, I don't want to neglect to ask either if there are other scholars, academicians out there that might be interested in supporting your efforts or becoming signers on your document, how did they get a hold of you?
They can just email me at Title IX Student Advocacy at gmail.com.
We'll put that below.
I was going to say.
Yes, or I think my website also has a contact me button, which they can do. I think right now we have something around 120 signatures, and I expect like some more before the final deadline. But I think this is kind of like beginning to, it's really important to spread the information, so to speak, because most people actually don't see the general picture, so to speak. They hear isolated complaints of discrimination from male students or professors. And just when you look at those like isolated cases, people think, okay, like this is maybe injustice, or maybe I don't know what happened. You know, maybe, you know, like maybe the guy's complaints are meritless, but this isn't about like a single individual. This is really about an entire class of protected people who are facing discrimination that has been very much enshrined into the political climate of college campuses. Exactly. And it's really outrageous. Like, why do they have all these programs?
Exactly. And the complaint lists all of the 26 programs that you feel are in error, that are not complying with Title IX, and it gives the reasons why, and it tells who they are. It's fascinating to read. And then you have one at the end where you say, and we're not going to complain about this particular women's group because you give the reasons why you don't.
Yes, like that particular group, I still suggested like some injunctive relief, but that particular group has, you know, they have more male research, like staff, and and I think they're also, what they're doing is also kind of like meaningful and like nonpartisan research. So I didn't really feel like that program kind of creates a hostile environment.
Right. Exactly. Whereas the others really do. You know?
Yes. And this complaint is really collaborative. I should emphasize that. I wrote like maybe like 60% of this complaint, but other people have also contributed passages. And it's also important to emphasize that that's just the surface narrative. There are so many footnotes, as I think there are 201 footnotes in the version that I currently have. And of course, many of those footnotes refer to research that is done, that has been conducted by many people in academia, including people in positions of power and influence, whose research has been ignored because of the stranglehold that radical feminism has over academic discourse. And some of these individuals are not like, you know, traditional conservatives, or like some of these people are actually, you know, they are on kind of the left-wing end of the spectrum, I think, but they are still like mobbed by you know, these like radical feminists who are like really far left, so to speak. So they still face mobbing. Like Laura Kipnis, for example, when she first came forward, I think it created kind of more of a stir, because like she's still like thinks of herself as a Marxist feminist, and she was still mobbed, like lynched by these like even more radical feminists because she made like some supportive statements for an accused male professor. So they do that. But I think at this point, like their ideology has it's becoming more marginalized, I think. And some people, you know, like not just conservatives, but also like some liberals have condemned, I think, like what is going on college campuses as some of this information started getting out. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, for example, condemned like the bias of Title IX tribunals. Yes, so it was kind of interesting. Margaret Atwood, as you know, who is like a very, very orthodox feminist figure. She, I think, sided with like a male professor, called it a witch hunt. And of course, Governor Brown vetoed SB 169, which I think shocked some of these like radical feminists, like that Stanford professor. It's really because like these policies are indefensible, and once you can kind of like get beyond their shaming tactics and like their blackmail tactics that like these like radical ideologues use, it really becomes indefensible. These policies become really indefensible. Like, how can you defend discrimination against the male minority, especially when they're falling behind, you know, when they're like numbers of enrollment are falling behind? And it doesn't really help anyone over the long term. It also doesn't really help women, because when you have a class of undereducated men, they're more likely to end up as like in criminal activity, for example, or it kind of contributes to the breakdown of the family structure, So like these policies that are pushed by these like radical leftists, they really help to undermine, you know, like the family structure. So that ends up like hurting the majority of women over the long term as well. So they're really bad policies, and we cannot unfortunately have a meaningful discussion. Only fairly recently, you know, we've been able to like push this issue into mainstream consciousness because of like all these like bad faith tactics that they're using.
Yeah, you know, one of the things I want people to know about, Chris, is that you're willing to help others get complaints together.
Yes, I do my best, although I'm very overwhelmed.
I'll bet you are. But
I've been like really...
The question I have for you now is, could people use some of this complaint when they file their own complaints?
Absolutely, of course. Like there's no copyright in any of these documents, which is why I published them online.
Yes.
That, of course, that's perfectly fine. Like
you use a lot of what you've written and plug in the offending places in a different
exactly university. Yes, and I'm perfectly okay with that. If I have time, I could even like provide even more help to people who want to file their own complaints, but you know, time is becoming increasingly limited, unfortunately.
Understand.
And I put a lot of effort into all of this. So
yes, you do, and it is appreciated.
Thank you. And yes, I really have to. I think I'm hoping that I can gradually just taper off once this gets going, so that I can focus on real professional development, because, you know,
yeah, I've been saying that for 10 years.
Yeah. But unfortunately, I think so far, like the burden has been, I mean, there are people, so there are attorneys like who handle these cases, of course, on a professional basis. They don't do it like pro bono, obviously, but they mostly specialize in helping accused male students, which is really just one, it's just like really one like slice of the whole pie, so to speak. It's just like one corner. So there are so many other like areas of discrimination, and because it's not currently possible to file, I guess, like lawsuits, you know, like challenging institutions for like damages or monetary awards, a lot of lawyers are not touching these. So it's just handled by like pro bono advocates like Mark Perry and myself. So as a kind of like political advocacy. So, but I'm hoping that kind of like more and more people will eventually pick this up as well. And at this point, I mean, I was hoping that if we can get just like a one clear federal precedent, then that will help, you know, other institutions might, you know, look up to that precedent in order to reform their policies, but they have no interest in doing that. Tulane University, even after a favorable resolution letter, they said, we are not going to follow these rules. So now they are not following the Department of Education suddenly, you know, like when the Department of Education is like trying to eliminate, yes, also political environment, like money and political environment, but they suddenly realized that they want to resist the Department of Education, even though they had no such concerns when the Department of Education was aggressively pushing this radical gender ideology. So it's sad, but it just shows that there's still a lot of like fighting to be done, and these like discrimination is not going to disappear on its own. And a part of the problem, I think, it's kind of like a circular issue here, as I think Janice mentioned earlier. Feminists attack male-only programs, and you know, like even kind of just like meetings. There was one case here at the University of Southern California, and there was an all-male panel about gaming, and campus administrators abolished that. So there was no intent to exclude women. There was one female speaker who kind of like canceled, I believe that was her own kind of her own cancellation at the last minute, and then the feminist administrators just prevented the whole thing from happening because it was an accidental conglomeration of like men with like no women kind of like in the mix. So even in situations like that, campus administrators deliberately sabotage any male-only groups, any male-only organizations, meetings. They do this very purposefully. And I heard from male students, there was like one student in an Ivy League institution who complained that, again, there were like 3 male students who were talking to each other, and the female TA, who apparently, you know, is yet another like women's studies type, just broke them apart. So I'm kind of mentioning this because some feminists said, why can't these men just create their own male-only groups or male-only programs or scholarships instead of complaining about women-only programs or scholarships, that's yet another disingenuous argument, because these radical feminist bureaucrats are the ones who have broken apart all those programs and like meetings and, you know, organizations.
Well said.
They do that very purposefully, while at the same time jealously maintaining this female-only scholarships, programs, departments, you know, like affirmative action preferences for the female majority. So this is intentional, and this is what they're doing.
Yes.
And this is what they did at Ryerson University. They shut down an attempt to form a men's group there.
Yeah.
And then the student union decided in advance that any future efforts to set up men's groups were deemed misogynistic by nature and therefore would be forbidden in advance.
Wow.
Yeah.
Was this in Canada, or do you know which institute?
Yeah, that's in Canada. Yeah.
Okay. Canada is apparently worse than the US. I mean, so I'm not entirely sure.
It's a seesaw.
Yeah,
We're in
I'm
a
not entirely
competition,
sure.
apparently.
Crazy stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I just wanted to mention that because, again, that's yet another like bad faith argument that they're coming up with in order to defend themselves against these complaints. They're saying, why can't men form their own groups? Well, it's because of you that men cannot form their own male-only groups. But one form of injunctive relief that is, I guess, like listed in these complaints and also all the other similar complaints is that if an institution wants to create male-only like scholarships or programs or like departments to balance all these like female-only groups, that's fine from our perspective. We are protesting the imbalance, so to speak. So we are not saying that everything should be absolutely gender neutral, you know, for everyone under every circumstances, etc. And obviously, like those gender like differences like makes sense in some situations, like athletic tournaments, or like I mean there are some situations in which, as you know, I mean men and women have different athletic like talents and capabilities, and if you eliminate those differences, then it's actually in a certain sense it's going to be unfair to the female athletes. But as you know, there's a lot of like controversy about like transgender activists who kind of like believe that transgender men should compete on the same tournaments with like biological women, and that does create an disadvantage against women. So so it's really kind of like complicated. But I'm not saying again, I'm bringing this up because some people have assumed that I have this like radical like gender blind ideology that I want to abolish all gender differences and things like that. That's not entirely true. I think, and again, the Supreme Court doctrine says that like those gender differences have to be I think it's called immediate scrutiny. So as long as there's like a rational basis behind that separation, like those separations or differences are fine. So I'm not saying that, for example, like it's okay to have like a women's crew team and it's okay to have a men's crew team. So I'm not saying that we should all merge like athletic teams or like fraternity. Like some people also want to abolish fraternities and sororities. To me, that really strikes me as unnecessary because, like, first, they're external, and second, fraternities and sororities are actually, like, they have an overall sense of balance. Like, you have fraternities for, like, male students and sororities for female students. So I'm not saying that everything should be absolutely gender neutral. As long as there's an overall sense of equivalence, then I'm okay with those programs. Like, I guess theoretically, that applies to women's studies, by the way. So an institution would have the freedom to abolish, for example, its women's studies program or create a similar department for men, like a men's studies program. Yeah. So that's the choice that they have.
Well said.
Yeah.
Well said.
And I guess theoretically, an institution can also do, like, if they want to, keep up affirmative action for women in business and like the few STEM disciplines in which they're still the minority, if they want to keep doing that. But if they also want to offer affirmative action for men in the disciplines in which they are the minority, they may try to balance that out. I mean, I don't really know how it will work. From my perspective, I think that will be very difficult to manage because it will create like a very complex affirmative action game.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Meritocracy is a lot simpler.
Mhm.
Yes, exactly. I think abolishing the preferences will be a lot simpler. But theoretically, you know, from a purely legal perspective, I think an institution can do that as well. So again, that's another choice that they have.
Yes. Are we about there, guys?
I think we are.
Oh, yeah, that was great.
That's been fascinating to hear you today. I really appreciate you spending the time with us.
Thanks. I think I did my best to summarize all the major issues.
You did a good job, man.
Thank
You did a
you.
really good job.
And folks, if you want to get involved, check below.
Yes,
The
send
link
him
is
your
there.
name if you want to be listed on these complaints, you know, because the more names, the better, you know.
Or use the draft of the Cornell complaint and form your own.
Amen. So we're good.
Okay, are we done recording?
Yeah, we've been recording. And now we're going to turn it off here in just a second. Are we finished, guys?
I think we're finished.
Okay.
All right, that's good. Y'all take care.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Chris.
We'll see you next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, see if I can turn